Well, tonight I was going to try to finish out Acts, but I can't. Acts chapter 27 has too much information, so we're going to have to finish it next week. But where we are at in Acts chapter 27, Paul has had all of his trials. He's now being sent back to Rome to face Nero. He appealed to Caesar, and that's where he was going to go. He doesn't get the 3-hour boat tour that Gilligan was offering. His turns into about a 7-month boat tour, which did make me think. I wonder if it doesn't have the captain's name listed in the book of Acts, and I just wonder if it was Gilligan. I don't know. Only eternity will tell, but he changed what should have been a month, give or take, tour into 7 months through the hardest of winter and nearly killed them all. So rough. What we're going to see is a very descriptive Luke. Luke writes this passage, and he gives precise detail that you can literally track their entire trip on a map. It's excellent. You would think it's a captain's log, what Luke wrote. It's really impressive. He's extremely precise. And as we're going through it, I want you to take note of how specific he is about geography, about the storm, just the specifics that he has. And then ask yourself the question, why did the Holy Spirit impress on Luke to be so accurate? We had years of Paul's ministry where Luke was by his side, and we don't have anything. It's just completely blank. But on this trip for 7 months, we have almost a daily log, practically. It's really incredible. And so I want you to ask yourself why as we go through. So let's start with Acts chapter 27, verse 1. When it was decided that we should sail to Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were transferred to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the emperor's division. A centurion had 100 troops underneath him. But what makes this guy specific and very important, he was of the emperor's division. He was of Nero's own personal guard. This guy holds a lot of sway. And for him to be taking Paul, that's saying something very important. That's saying this guy has a lot of clout. And you'll notice who's giving the orders throughout this chapter, and it's this guy. And then you'll see as this man starts to trust Paul, then he lets Paul give the orders, the prisoner, which this is incredible. After boarding a ship from, I have no idea how to pronounce that word, and even trying to pronounce that word, listening to the people online, I still couldn't get it. So it's that place, whatever that place is. That was about to sail to the ports on the coast of Asia, but we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, went with us. So you have Paul, Luke, and Aristarchus. Aristarchus was the one that started the whole row in Jerusalem. They thought he was in the temple when he wasn't, and that's what got Paul arrested. But these three men, it's pretty interesting. As a prisoner, you weren't allowed to have anybody go with you. But the centurion allows Paul to have 2 people take care of his needs, which is pretty impressive. In verse 37, we'll notice that it says that there's 276 people in total on this boat. Their idea was to travel north and go to the southern edge of what we would know as Turkey today, and bounce from port to port. The reason is, back then, they didn't like to travel over open water, and it's getting late in the season where bad weather is supposed to start. And so their hope is that we'll just kind of bounce around until we can either get there and the weather allows us, or when the weather gets bad, we just station ourselves at a port. But, you know the old poem, the best laid plans of mice and men often come to naught. That's exactly what's going to happen here. Verse 3, the next day we arrived at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly, allowing him to visit his friends there and receive any care he needed. After putting out from there, we sailed on the sheltered side of Cyprus because the winds were against us. We sailed along the sea of Cilicia and Pamphylia and reached Myra and Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship bound for Italy and put us on it. Now the picture in the next slide is what the ship would have looked like back then. It was actually a really neat display. The boat itself, the display, was actually wood. It was a replica, but much smaller. But you'll notice in the next slide, hopefully, the people that you'll see on it, they were actually holograms, and they moved like a whole video, but you could be on any side of it and watching these holograms and these people work on the boat and all. It was kind of neat. But you'll see, this would have been an Egyptian, Alexandria, Egypt, grain ship. And it mentions later on in the verses that they were carrying grain to Italy. It was about 140 to 180 feet long. It was about 40 to 50 feet wide. And this one doesn't show it because this is a smaller one, but they were around 44 feet deep. So they were a large ship. Their problem was, though, they only had one mast and it was square. They also didn't have a rudder, so they couldn't steer with the wind. They had two big paddles that you can see in the back. They must have had a lot of brute soldiers to be able to, and sailors to be able to move that thing around. The problem was, it was a sturdy ship, it was very strong, but it did not do well when you were in bad weather because the wind blew you wherever it wanted to take you. You couldn't steer out of it. And that's the reason Paul and them are going to be in the shipwreck, is because they were using this ship that couldn't last in oversea, out in the ocean, severe weather. And you'll see that come up as we talk about it. All right, verse 7. I just wanted you to be able to get a view of what that ship would have looked like. We sailed slowly for a number of days with difficulty arriving in Cnidus, I hope. Then, because the wind was against us, we sailed on the sheltered side of Crete off Cape Salome. Sailing past it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near the town of Lycia. Much time had been lost, and because navigation had become dangerous, the day of fasting had already passed. Paul began to warn those on the ship, "Men, I see that during this voyage there will be hardship and heavy loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also of our lives." It mentions here the day of fasting. That would have been the Day of Atonement, which would put it somewhere in early to mid-October. They didn't want to sail anywhere past October because the winds were heavy coming from the south and it was very treacherous on the boats. The distance you could probably think of somewhere around northern Florida, taking a ship from northern Florida and going to Oklahoma. Okay? But again, they were bouncing port to port, so it would have taken them longer than that, but that's about the distance. It's not as long as what we would actually think. And it took them 7 months to do so. Well, verse 11. But the centurion was persuaded by the pilot and the owner of the ship, and not by what Paul said. Since the harbor was not a good place to spend the winter, most of the men favored putting out to sea from there on a chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix and spend the winter there. Not Arizona, by the way. It is a Cretan harbor that faces southwest and northwest. The place where they were at was a small, dangerous port. They had 276 people on board. With a small port, it would probably not be sufficient to take care of the needs of 276 people, housing and food for an entire winter. So the ship's captain's like, "I really don't like this place. It's not good enough to take care of us. Not to mention, I have a very expensive boat with a lot of expensive cargo out on a port that's going to get beat to death all winter long." He says, "I really don't like that. I want to be on the nicer side where it's not going to get as much storm damage." That's the idea. That's the discussion they're having. And in practical human terms, that makes sense. That's good sailing wisdom. The problem is when God's messenger tells you something and you don't listen, there's probably a reason he's told it to you. Well, they didn't listen. Verse 13, when a gentle breeze began to blow from the south, they thought they could make it to Phoenix, so they hoisted anchor and began sailing along the shore of Crete. If you haven't noticed, up until this point, they have had zero good weather. The only good weather that they get is after they've disobeyed what the man of God said. Have you ever noticed in your life that you feel like God's doing something and you're supposed to be obeying and you're obeying, and then you get a good question about what you're supposed to do? One's hard and one's super easy. And when you take the super easy route, you find yourself in lots of trouble. I remember I had an offer to preach at a church. It was a very good offer, a very lucrative offer. And I told the person that called me about it, I said, give me a week and I'll pray about it. So I prayed about it for a week and I just felt like God saying no. So that's what I called. I called back and said, well, I just feel like God's told us, no, we need to stay where we're at. Within a month, there was like 3 different major problems that happened. And I'm like, well, Lord, what was I supposed to do? Well, those were a distraction from the enemy because I was doing exactly what he told me to do, even though it wasn't easy. And by doing what exactly he told me to do, he blessed our church even because of it. Well, sometimes the gentle breeze and the easygoing path is neither. It just looks like it. If God gives us directions and plans, if he tells us to do it, then it's up to him to finish the job. If we are being obedient, it's up to him to keep to his word and protect us. If God offers you an umbrella and you decide to run out from underneath it, you can better believe that you're going to get wet. And if you stay out long enough, you'll probably catch cold. So take what he gives you and trust him that it's enough. Verse 14. But it was not long before a violent, the word is typhonikos. It's where we get our word typhoon from. Okay? So it wasn't long before a violent typhoon-like wind called a nor'easter swept down from the island. The ship was caught so that it couldn't face the wind. Remember, they can't steer with it. They just have to let the wind carry it. And we gave up and we were swept along. As we drifted to the sheltered side of the small island called Calda, we barely managed to secure the ship's lifeboat. The ship's crew pulled it up on deck and used ropes to brace the ship, fearing that they would hit a large sandbank near Libya. Now think about this. They were trying to be on the north side, the southern border of Turkey. They have been pushed by this typhoon all the way to the shores of Libya, North Africa, all the way straight across the Mediterranean. Bad day for sailing, right? Days. They lowered the sail and they drifted along. Notice verse 17. They have a lifeboat. There's 276 people on this boat. That's going to be a very impressive lifeboat. They take the lifeboat. It's so bad they nearly lose it. They don't want to lose it. So they lift that boat that will hold 276 people and they put it on top of the deck and they latch it together. It would make things very difficult. But this is how desperate they are. They know how bad of a situation they're in. Also, they wrap ropes around the ship. Now what they do, I actually, for a couple years anyways, as a side job, I worked at a dock where we were rebuilding a ship. And it was a wood ship. It was actually a wood yacht, old, but it was pretty. And because I did woodworking, that's That's why they hired me. Anyways, and so what you'd do is you'd put your planks in and you'd nail them, and then you'd have to caulk them, and they would pitch them. But you would soak it so that it would hold water. The fear is that either your screws that we would use or the nails that they might use or plugs would come loose. If a boat is getting twisted like this in the water with wind and waves, it's very easy for those boards underneath to pop off. Well, you can figure what happens when you start having boards on the bottom of your boat flying off. You're in serious trouble. So what they would do is they would take ropes and they would wrap it around the boat itself to keep those timbers in place, even though the boat's shifting. So that's what they've done. They are literally doing everything they can to just keep this thing from running up adrift onto the reef. Verse 18, the next day, because we were being tossed so violently by the storm, we began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's equipment overboard with their own hands. You get the idea. At first, all right, well, we're going to lose money here, but let's at least throw off some grain, lighten the load, it won't be so hard on the ship. By the next day, they're like, forget this. All right, start throwing ropes over, start throwing the tackling over, the things that help you sail the ship, just get rid of it. We're just trying to survive. Priorities, right? For the number of days, neither the sun nor the stars were to be seen. The storm continued to rage until all hope of our being saved vanished. They had no compasses back then. Their navigation was by the sun and the stars. That's it. But when you're in the middle of a typhoon, you don't see either one of those. So by this point, all hope that they were going to live through this was gone. They were doing their best, but they knew they were all going to die. Verse 21, after they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up among the shipmates and said, men, you should have listened to me. I told you so. And not have sailed from Crete. You would have avoided this hardship and damage. Isn't there always one in the crowd? You know, you go through something miserable. I told you so. If you'd have just listened to me, it'd have all been right. Well, that's exactly what Paul did. But he did it for a reason. He didn't do it out of pride or that, well, you should have listened to me, to give credit to his voice. What he actually used it for was the foundation for the promise that God had given him. Hey, folks, he gave me a promise back there. You didn't listen. He's given me another promise. Listen this time and let's get spared from this. Notice, verse 22, but now I urge you to have courage. All hope's been long since lost that they're going to live through it. But there will be no loss of life among you, but only loss of the ship. For just last night, an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood by me and said, stop being afraid, Paul. You must stand before the emperor. Indeed, God has given to you the lives of everyone who is sailing with you. I love the honesty of the scripture. This is not the first time that we have been told that Paul was scared for his life. And what happened last time, and it's happened multiple times throughout Paul's life, is God sent an angel to give Paul peace and encourage him. And that's what happens here. I love it. Paul was just like any of the rest of us. He was scared that he was going to die. Paul had for a long time that he was supposed to go to Rome. He had it. He believed that this was God's call for him to go to Rome. He'd said it all the way before while he was in Turkey the last time in his third missionary journey. And now they're not even sure if they're going to live through this. And Paul's probably wondering at this point, God, did I just not hear you right? And I've been planning all of this, going this way, and I'm not doing what I'm supposed to? God sends him hope. God says, Paul, I've still got you in my hand. You're still obeying me. I'm still going to keep to my promise to you. Just because a non-believer made a poor choice and didn't listen to Paul's advice does not change God's will. Now, sometimes we get in some really bad situations and it's our own fault. That's life. Sometimes it's the choice of others that we have no control over. It's life. Sometimes God allows you to go through it for purposes, and that's what we'll talk about at the close. Verse 25. The angel says, Paul says, take courage, men, because I trust God that it will turn out just as he told me. However, we will have to run aground on some island. Verse 27. It was the 14th night, and we were drifting through the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight the sailors suspected that land was near. After taking soundings, and what they do with soundings, they have a weight on a long rope, and they would throw it over the ship, and they would wait until they either feel it or hear the weight hit the ground. And then they would tell by how long the rope is, how deep it was. And that's what they mean by taking soundings. They found that the depth to be 20 fathoms, or 200 feet. A little later, they took soundings again, and they found that it was 15 fathoms, so 90 feet. So they're going uphill. That means they're coming close to land. Fearing that we might run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and began praying for daylight to come. Meanwhile, the sailors began trying to escape from the ship. They lowered the lifeboat into the sea and pretended that they were going to lay out the anchors from the boat. Paul told the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men remain on board, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and set it adrift. Notice the difference in wording between verses 30 and 32. Who was the ones trying to leave? The sailors. Who was the one that prevented them from leaving? The soldiers. Now, this is interesting because we know that the soldiers would have done nothing unless Julius the centurion said, hey, stop those boys. But whose words were the ones that enabled that? It was Paul's. Paul said, listen, they're going to leave. And if they leave, we're all dead. You better not let them go. And so the centurion took Paul's words so strongly that he ordered his men to go cut the lifeboat free. There's a reason the lifeboat is named a lifeboat. This was this was the centurion going all in on faith in Paul's words. If Paul's wrong, they're all dead. But the centurion has been so convinced of Paul's godliness that he's willing to risk his life and every life on that ship. Wow. Can you imagine the sailors and the soldiers having an argument over this? I guarantee you it didn't go well. And I guarantee you the sailors who were scared for their life watching that lifeboat float away, there must have been a little uncomfortable moves in that point. Verse 33. Right up to daybreak, Paul kept urging all of them to eat something. He said, today is the 14th day that you've been waiting and going without food, not eating anything. I remember as a boy, my dad had a friend that had a boat, a rather large boat. And we went out on Lake Huron, which Lake Huron, it's a big lake. It's one that you can't see across it. I mean, you can't see side to side. It's a big lake. And we went out, and it was a day that it wasn't a terrible day of turbulence, a lot of wind and waves, but it was decent. And I remember the guy that owned the boat said, well, here, let your boys drive that boat. And so I'm trying to navigate across those waves. And like I said, they weren't real big. They were probably, 7-8 footers, something like that. You hit those things with a bigger boat, and it doesn't matter if it's a bigger boat. You're going boom, man, boom, man. And my dad was doing his best to hurry and grab me as the guy that owned the boat said, he's all right. And Dad's like, no, he's not. You take over. I can't imagine what would be going on in the ocean with a boat that you can't steer with a canvas up above you that's just sending you wherever it's going to go. These guys, I can't imagine how sick they were. There's an old joke about a seaman. He was a young seaman, and he was on the deck of the boat, and somebody comes up to him and asks, he says, has the captain come onto the deck? And he says, well, if I swallowed him, he did. Because he lost it all. These guys didn't even want to look at food. They were so seasick. But all from midnight on till daybreak, Paul is urging them to eat because they haven't eaten for 2 weeks. So I urge you, verse 34, to eat something, for it will help you survive, since none of you will lose so much as a hair from your head. After he said this, he took some bread. He thanked God in front of everyone, broke it, and began to eat. Now, I don't know about you, but this would have been an awkward situation if I was somebody else other than Paul. If Paul's God is so powerful to protect us, why are we in the situation we're in? And most certainly, why is Paul thanking him for the hardtack that we're eating? Right? They're hungry, they're scared, they have no hope of living. They're seasick as all get out, and these are seasoned sailors. And this guy's in the middle, in front of everyone, praying to his God and saying, thank you for what we have. I don't know about that, but that'd have been a rough situation. But Paul's faith in the midst of this gives the people hope beyond their situation. Sometimes God allows us to go through storms so that those that are around us can see what we go through, and it encourages their faith so that they can walk stronger too. And that's what happens here. Verse 36, everyone was encouraged and had something to eat. There were 276 of us on the ship. After they had eaten, they all wanted, and they began to lighten the ship by dumping its cargo of wheat into the sea. When day came, they didn't recognize the land, but they could see a bay with a beach on it, which they planned to run the ship ashore if possible. Remember, that was exactly what Paul had told them earlier. So they cut the anchors free, and they left them in the sea. At the same time, they untied the ropes that held the steering oars, raised the foresail to the wind, and headed for the beach. So in other words, the wind's going from the south going to the northeast. They drop everything they can that's going to weight it down, bare bones. They put the sail up and say, let's go for a ride, and they sail northward right into the beach to scuttle the ship. Verse 40, so they cut the anchors free and they left them in the sea. At the same time, they untied the ropes, steering oars. Sorry, I already read that. Verse 41, but they struck a sandbar and ran the ship aground. The bow struck and couldn't be moved, while the stern was broken into pieces by the force of the waves. This is so detailed and accurate. All throughout this entire conversation, this entire chapter, Luke has been giving us very specific information about where they were at, what they were doing, how long it took. You could follow this on a map. Why would the Holy Spirit give such details? Why is that? Why does it matter? In the next slide, you'll see a map of what they endured. Now, like I said, you see Myra over on the right of the screen, on the far east. That's southern Turkey. Their goal was to go up and down from port to port, go across to Greece, and then go around Cilicia and up. But when the storm hit, everything changed. And down there, they went around Crete, and there's Claudia where they should have stayed. They didn't. They kept going, and then they got lost. And they ended up almost down there to Libya in the south, all the way over here to Malta, where they wrecked. I want to take you down just a short little rabbit trail because this is really cool, at least to me. I've tried to point out periodically when I remembered how precise this passage is for geography and for time. This is so specific, you could use this passage as a treasure map. If they dropped off treasure, you'd be able to find it because of how specific it was. Do you remember by chance, any treasure or something that someone might find as treasure? Do you remember them in the story dropping it off? I mentioned it. Nope, because that would have been destroyed by the weather. What wouldn't have been destroyed that today, some 2,000 years later, someone might consider treasure and go find it? The anchors. That's exactly right. Daniel, just go back one slide. Show them verse 40. So they cut the anchors free and they left them in the sea. And then they ran the boat aground. They beached it. Okay, so go back forward again. Do you remember how specific it was, though? It said that they ran headlong into the beach. It mentions which direction the wind was blowing. So the wind was blowing from behind them to push the ship, because that's the only way they can row, right? So you know that where they landed had to be on what side of the island? Had to be on the south side, because the wind's coming up, it's pushing them behind, they have to be on the bottom side, the south side of the island. You know that it was less than 90 feet deep because they'd already done soundings. If that's the case, with today's technology, it would be relatively easy to find those anchors. Now, we know that the anchors, they're built out of wood, but they would have a crossbar on them that was pure lead. Well, the wood would have long since rotted away after 2,000 years, but that lead would still be in the ocean. Now, what's the reason I bring all of this up is because there was a guy that did exactly that. He took Acts chapter 27 and used it as a treasure map and said, if they're in the sea that shallow, we should be able to find them. And he did. The man's name was Bob Cornuke. You'll see him here in the center, a rose among two thorns. One's my dad, the other one's me. He was one of our guides on our archaeological Israel trip. Thinking of him, think of a godly Indiana Jones. That's the best way I know how to describe him. He's found several things in the Bible that are treasures archaeologically because he believes that the Bible is just true. And so he uses the Bible as a treasure map and has found several things. Very interesting. Several things that they're not sure if it's still right yet, but there's a lot of archaeology that's pointing to it. And the reason I say he's a rose among two thorns, in the picture up on the right, this is him praying over my dad and my dad's ministry while we were in the Garden of Gethsemane. We met where Jesus prayed in his last night with his disciples. And while we were there, we had a time of prayer. And he took my dad off to the side and prayed with my dad over my dad's ministry and for my dad. It was really thoughtful of him. But I snapped a quick picture and tried not to disrupt. Now, what's interesting, though, and you can find it on the next slide, he wrote a book about it, his finding these anchors. And then there's a YouTube movie if you want to watch it. It's only 33 minutes, but that's actually the link to it right there. I just highlighted it, copied it, and pasted it, and put it on the slide so you could know where to find it. But anyways, it's called The Search for the Lost Shipwreck of Paul. And this is him on the bottom left with the one of them that they found. And that's now in the Malta Museum. God's word is so honest and so true, so precise. Yes, if you dig down, it's got some fantastic spiritual information, some powerful things. But if you take what it says, it's so precise, you can use it as a treasure map. And that's exactly what Bob did. Fantastic. Fantastic. It blows my mind how precise the word is. It's wonderful. And Bob's a great guy. He's funny, got a great sense of humor, but he's a man of God too. All right, to close out, verse 42. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, to keep them from swimming ashore and escaping. But the centurion, notice, wanting to save Paul. Paul has made a really big impact. He wasn't just a prisoner. He let him go up on the shore, go visit friends, and then come back. What other prisoner would you let them do that? In fact, they're willing to kill all of the prisoners just so the prisoners can't do that. Later on, he's not just listening to Paul, he's obeying Paul's orders. And now, just to save Paul's life, not anybody else's, just to save Paul's life, he tells his soldiers not to kill any of the prisoners. So he prevented them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to follow, some on planks and some on various pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone got to shore safely. One of my Bible teachers, he said that this was the first instance of surfing, because the guys got on the boards and they surfed in from the ship. He said, well, it's probably not true, but he said he'd like to think that it was because he liked to surf. God spared Paul again, and this time it was by way of the centurion. Not just Paul, though. Everyone on that ship was spared because God had put a true promise in Paul, and he kept it, even under the most terrible of situations. God's promise to Paul was proven true, and not a single life was lost. God's plan done God's way is always accompanied with God's blessing. I want to just show you really briefly how bad this was. So in verse 4, when they set sail, it says the winds were against us. In verse 8, it says sailing past it with difficulty. Verse 13, the only time that it's actually nice while they're sailing for 7 months was the only time that they shouldn't have sailed. That was it. Verse 14, the violent wind was a typhoon. Verse 18, they were tossed around violently by the storm, so much so that they had to throw cargo overboard. In verse 20, for a number of days they neither saw the sun nor the stars, and all hope of them surviving had vanished. That's some rough sailing. It's a lot of rough weather. If God really wanted Paul to go to Rome, why did he put all of this mess in the... we see of Galilee, right? They're all in the boat. Jesus, on multiple occasions, just says the word and the storm stops. Could he not do that for Paul? Is he somehow limited? What's the deal, God? If you want me to go to Rome, why are you putting all of these storms in the way? Why not just let him get there? Why not let him just take the easy route? The question is raised, why do we have storms in our life? Well, sometimes it's our own foolishness, right? We make some bad choices, and it creates a lot of problems for us. Hey, I'm dumb, I do it. But sometimes it's not our fault. Sometimes it's other people, right? They make bad choices, and then they put us through the ringer, and we get the storm. Sometimes, and we don't like to think about this, but sometimes it's God's design. Because God has a purpose in the storm. Was God trying to tell Paul not to go this way? Some have said that it's true. Well, I don't think so, and I'm going to give 2 reasons. This is kind of a sidelight, but I think it's important. God was not trying to redirect Paul. For one, it wasn't Paul's choice to be floating on that Mediterranean Sea. He was all more than willing to stay at the one port and not go on. It wasn't his fault that they didn't listen to him. So God's not disciplining Paul for somebody else's choice. The second thing is, God sent an angel to encourage him that, hey, no lives are going to be lost, and I've got you, buddy. You're going to make it all the way there. So this wasn't God trying to prevent Paul from going to Rome. So why the storms? I don't know about you, but I like no storms. I like the easy route. I like every good thing going smooth sailing. I get seasick really easy. But God doesn't promise us a life of ease. In fact, God promises a hard life. A life where we daily die to His will and what He wants, no matter our present situation. Yuck. Don't know how else to say that. God uses the storms of our life that will come to change us. Romans 8:28, God promises that He will what? All things work to our bad? No, all things work to our good, to those that are called, who love God and are called according to His purpose. He can take any storm that we come through, and our life sure comes through some storms. He can take any of them and use them for our good because our God is that powerful. Paul was completely invincible until God was done with him. He was absolutely safe, even floating on a boat in the middle of a typhoon. Satan had no touch on him. You could think of Job, right? Job, man, he had a rough way to go. He was doing really well, and then Satan got a hold of him, and he was doing really bad. But the entire time you read through the book of Job, what's the one thing you see? God's hand over Job saying, Satan, this far and no more, because you're not touching him all the way. And then God turned around and blessed him double. Similar to what happened here for Paul. There's all kinds of messes that took place in these storms, and God said, nope, you're not touching a single life, Satan. We are not out of His safety as long as we're not out of His will. Everything that we face is Father filtered. God is in control, and if He made a promise to keep us, it is up to His faithfulness to keep His promise. So I have I have 6 things that are the purposes of God in a storm. Now, this is not an exhaustive list and definitely could be reworded to be better, but I was trying to start with phrases that started with re. So just deal with it. That's it. God uses storms in our life so that we rely on Him. Paul had nothing else in which he could trust. Not the boat, not the sailors, not the soldiers, not the centurion, not Luke, not Aristarchus. There was absolutely nothing in his life that he could trust. The only one that he could rely on was God Himself. When we get in the situations and the storms of life, we realize that everything that we used to rely on isn't enough to save us. We could build all the money in the world and inflation hit overnight and it's all gone like a fart in the wind. Right? Am I being honest? A little too honest? We can have 4 good tires that are relatively brand new and run over 2 screws and be stuck on the side of the road. Right? It happens in a moment. The storms of life call us to rely on Him and Him alone. And sometimes, let's just be honest, we need that refocus. Because we get so busy with life and doing it ourselves and trying hard, and we forget that, hey, it's all from Him anyway. And we can rest in Him. It also refocuses our life direction. Paul was discouraged. He needed an answer from God. Was he being faithful? Was God going to be faithful and rescue them? When they were in the storm, he needed direction. God, what am I to do before I die? And God gave it to him. When we're in the storms of life, we often realize that we are messing with Satan's kingdom. And Satan's kingdom doesn't like it. And he fights hard. It's kind of funny. I even had it in my notes before my wife called and told me that she had a tire down. But about a month ago, or a month or 2 ago, it was so obvious that it was Satan attacking. It's one thing if it's a little bit here and there and you're just wondering, well, if this is life or if this is my own poor decisions. But man, for a while there, I put 7 tires on in 2 weeks. Had my computer literally short-circuit itself within that next week. I mean, there was just so much that happened, and it was to the point you just laughed and said, all right, what else are you going to bring, Satan? God, what are you going to do about this? And God provided and God took care. Sometimes it helps us in the storm to refocus and say, okay, am I going the right way? And if I am, and Satan is just the one that's attacking, help me to set my jaw, Lord, and push on and push through. Helps us to refocus. It also helps us to reevaluate life's valuables. They started chucking cargo overboard, then they started chucking the tackle. Eventually, they were willing to scuttle the ship because the one thing that was most important was the lives that were on that ship. When we get in the struggle and in the storm, when the house is burning down, we don't go to save the pictures. We don't go to save the furniture. We go to save the kids. The lives are the most important thing. It helps us to refocus in the storm. Sometimes all the junk that we collect at a yard sale, we don't need it anymore. We can sell it off and we'll be just fine. It helps us to reevaluate life's valuables. It also removes weakness. Self-preservation makes us stronger. We are focused on survival and getting better, and we want to work out whatever it takes so that we make it. We put ourselves through anything just so that we survive. There's a story in 1966. Growing up, it was about an hour from where I was born and raised in Lake Huron. And like I said, Lake Huron, it's a big lake. It's massive. And there was this massive freighter that was traveling through. It was its last trip going on November 30th through the lake. And there were 60-mile-an-hour winds, 35-foot waves, and it took that massive freighter ship and literally snapped the end off of the freighter. And it started to go down. And the only guy that survived, his name was Dennis Hale. And he said he was facing the other way, and they're trying to hold on, and they're seasick. And he said, all of a sudden, I heard this loud bang. And he said, I turned around, and I watched the whole back end of the ship snap off and go into the water. And then the rest of the boat start to sink. And we're talking about icy water at this point. Wearing only boxers, a wool coat, and a life jacket, he survived in the icy waters for 14 hours before crawling to shore. He lost 25 pounds in 14 hours, just his body fighting to survive. He ended up having to have like 12 different surgeries just to make it, and he did. My point to all that is, self-preservation removes our weakness. And sometimes when we get in the storm, all we've got left is to hold on and fight just to survive. The last one is revival. All 276 people on that ship were spared, and they saw the power of God through life's most difficult circumstances. I think, honestly, I believe that revival broke out on that ship because you can see a difference in how they viewed Paul towards the end of the chapter. If you go to verse 24, it says that God has given you the lives of everyone who is sailing with you. And I honestly, the wording sounds very similar, not just of their physical lives, but their souls. They looked on and they saw the power of God working through Paul. They saw that God kept his promise to Paul, and it changed their lives too. You can definitely see it in the centurion, but I think the rest of them as well. Sometimes God puts us through the storm so that he can use us so that everyone around us sees his power and brings them to salvation. And I'll close with this story. Mike, who we've talked about on several occasions, they came and spoke, Mike and Shannon. Mike was in the middle of a tank working on a motor. And he said normally a motor like that, he said it'd be a day and we'd be done and we'd be leaving. And the guy that was working with me, we ran into one problem after the other. Absolutely nothing was working. And it was 3 days long, and they were stuck in this tank. Couldn't get it to work for nothing. And finally, after those 3 days, Mike decided to just pray about it. I'm like, all right, Lord, I've done everything I can do. So he stopped with this guy. This guy was an atheist. He didn't believe. He was a hard man, would not budge for the Lord, and Mike had been praying for him. So Mike prays about it, and within just a few minutes, the machine just worked. Just worked. He said, I literally have no idea what I did to make it work. It just worked. And the guy stopped him and said, I have seen you for the last 3 days, and you haven't done any of the things that I would have been doing through the mess that was this job. I don't know what you have, but I want it. God used 3 days of misery for Mike working on a machine so that the guy next to him would see the peace of God in his life and want it for himself. And the man found Jesus because of it. Sometimes God brings us through a storm so that there might be a revival. We know that storms will come. It's a part of life. We also know that we are invincible until God is done with us. That being said, grab an umbrella because there's going to be a storm. Come underneath the will of God, be obedient to it, trust Him, and let Him take care of the rest. And who knows what might happen. You may just see a miracle. Let's pray.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. It really does mean the world to me that you're getting a blessing out of it. If this video was a blessing, make sure to hit that thumbs up button for me. That way other people can find it as well. Here in the link section, you'll find playlists and new videos that we put out. We try to do 2 or 3 a week. You can also subscribe to the channel by pressing on my face and then hitting the bell icon, and that will alert you to new videos. May God richly bless you.